The Three Who Built the Impossible, an American epic of steel, sacrifice, and the Brooklyn Bridge. Book 1, The Visionary and the Genesis. Chapter 1, The Prussian Philosopher and the Birth of Wire Rope. The story of the Brooklyn Bridge is not merely the story of a structure. It is the culmination of a philosophical ideal brought to life by an immigrant named John Augustus Roebling. Born in 1806 in the German city of Mühlhausen, Roebling was a man steeped in the intellectual ferment of early 19th century Europe. He studied architecture, engineering, and philosophy at the Polytechnic Institute in Berlin under the tutelage of the great philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. Roebling saw the world not as a collection of separate physical facts, but as an interconnected system, an idea that would later manifest in his unique approach to engineering. His early career was marked by disappointment in rigid Prussian society. Seeking a place where pure merit and innovation could thrive, he emigrated to the United States in 1831, settling initially in Pennsylvania. He briefly attempted farming, but his intellect was too restless, his hands too eager to build. His true calling found him in the rapidly expanding American canal and railroad network. At the time, heavy hemp ropes were used to pull canal boats over inclined planes and to haul wagons. These ropes were unreliable, susceptible to rot, and costly to replace. Roebling, drawing on his knowledge of metallurgy and mathematics, realized he could harness the incredible tensile strength of iron wire. In 1841, near Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, he perfected a revolutionary process, twisting multiple strands of high-quality iron wire into a compact, immensely strong cable. This wire rope was 5 times stronger than hemp rope of the same thickness and far more durable. Roebling's invention was a commercial and engineering breakthrough, and he quickly established the John A. Roebling Sons Company. Wire rope was a tool waiting for its ultimate purpose, the suspension bridge. Prior to Roebling, suspension bridges in America were seen as temporary, swaying, and dangerous structures, often failing spectacularly. Roebling's bridges, however, were marvels of calculated stability. He introduced the use of diagonal stays, wire ropes running from the tower tops down to the deck, to stiffen the roadway and distribute dynamic loads, mitigating the dangerous effects of wind and traffic. His first great triumphs, the Allegheny Aqueduct, 1845, the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge, 1855, and the Cincinnati-Covington Bridge over the Ohio River, 1866, established him as the world's preeminent suspension engineer. The Niagara Bridge in particular was considered the 8th wonder of the world, successfully carrying loaded freight trains hundreds of feet above the gorge. Roebling was obsessed with achieving absolute permanence. He viewed his bridges as organic continuations of the landscape, not as temporary human intrusions. This belief in the enduring nature of his work would become the driving force behind his final, most ambitious plan.
Chapter 2, The East River Challenge and the Fatal Folly. The East River was, by all accounts, an impossibility. It was not a true river, but a tidal strait, notorious for its swift, treacherous currents up to 7 knots, its massive ice flows in winter that could crush any conventional pier, and the incessant, heavy maritime traffic, sailing ships, steamships, and barges demanding an exceptionally high clearance. To bridge this waterway between the bustling metropolis of Manhattan and the burgeoning residential city of Brooklyn required a main span of 1,595 feet and a vertical clearance of 135 feet above high water. No bridge in history had ever come close to these dimensions. Roebling's solution, drafted meticulously over the 1860s, was pure, audacious genius. He proposed a structure that would combine the strength of a masonry arch with the elegance of a suspension span. Massive granite towers, two gigantic neo-Gothic towers built from solid granite resting on foundations sunk to bedrock. These towers would serve as anchor points and gravity stabilizers. Steel cables. Roebling proposed using steel wire for the main cables, a material 10 times stronger than iron but still new and unproven in large construction. He calculated that 4 cables, each 15.75 inches in diameter, containing 5,282 individual steel wires, would be sufficient. The stiffening truss. The roadway would be stiffened by deep, heavy trusses and those familiar diagonal stays, ensuring stability even in a hurricane. Roebling presented his plans to the New York Bridge Company in 1867. His proposal was detailed, mathematically sound, and breathtaking in its scope. The company approved the plan, recognizing that only Roebling possessed the intellect and reputation to pull it off. The cost was estimated at $7 million, which would more than double before completion. The preliminary work began in early 1869. John Roebling, at 63, was full of nervous energy. He needed to make final measurements for the placement of the Brooklyn Tower, which required him to be on the wooden ferry rack at the water's edge. On a warm summer day in July 1869, while guiding the measurement party, a ferry entering the slip failed to brake correctly. The massive wooden side of the ferry surged into the rack. Roebling, distracted by the measurements, was caught in the collision. His foot was severely crushed between the timbers and the dock. It was a devastating, ironic end for a man who had mastered the greatest forces of nature. He was killed not by a gale or a collapsing cable, but by a common ferry, the very mode of transport his life's work was meant to render obsolete. In a tragic error rooted in his 19th century distrust of conventional medicine, Roebling refused amputation or proper antiseptic treatment. He insisted on hydrotherapy, constantly pouring cold water over the wound. Infection set in rapidly. Tetanus or lockjaw was diagnosed. Within weeks, on July 22, 1869, the visionary who conceived the impossible bridge was dead, having never laid the first foundation stone. The burden of the great work immediately fell to his son, Washington Augustus Roebling.
Book 2. Descent into the Depths. Chapter 3. The Terrible Beauty of the Caisson. Washington Roebling, who had served as a trusted apprentice to his father and as a major in the Union Army, where he pioneered military bridge building, was instantly named chief engineer. At 32, he faced a task that would have crushed a lesser man. He knew the plans, but his first challenge was arguably the most dangerous: sinking the foundations. The Manhattan and Brooklyn piers had to carry over 80,000 tons of weight each, the tower, the cables, and the roadway, and stand firm against the relentless river forces. They needed bedrock. Washington decided on the pneumatic caisson method, an adaptation of European techniques. The Brooklyn caisson was built first, an astonishing piece of woodworking. It was a massive, inverted box constructed of thick southern yellow pine, 172 feet long, 102 feet wide, and 14 feet high. Its roof was a labyrinth of heavy timber, ready to bear the weight of the granite tower above it. The edges of the box were lined with a sharp iron cutting edge to help it sink through the mud. Once launched, The caisson weighed 3,000 tons. It was moored over the foundation site, and the chamber underneath was pressurized with air from immense steam-powered pumps. This pressurized air, often reaching 22 psi, or pounds per square inch, or 1.5 atmospheres above normal, was the only thing preventing the East River from flooding the chamber. As the granite blocks of the tower were placed on the roof, the tremendous weight began to push the caisson down. Inside, the dark subterranean chamber, the plenum, hundreds of sandhogs began the brutal, agonizing work of digging. The conditions were a blend of hell and wonder. The air pressure was so high that workers' voices sounded like Donald Duck due to the change in air density. The high pressure also enabled men to perform incredible feats of strength, allowing them to lift immense stones. But the labor was relentless, often performed with pickaxes and shovels in thick, clinging mud. All the excavated material, sand, mud, massive boulders, and ancient artifacts like shipwrecks and mastodon tusks, had to be hoisted out through a small vertical shaft called the water shaft, where the pressure was equalized by the water depth, or through the airlock system. Chapter 4. The Sandhog's Hell and the Rise of caissons disease. The true horror began when the Brooklyn caisson reached a depth of 44.5 feet, and the Manhattan caisson, the deepest foundation ever attempted, plunged past 70 feet. The pressure inside the Manhattan chamber peaked at 47 psi, or over 3 times the normal pressure at sea level. Washington Roebling, a leader who believed in sharing the hardship, spent countless hours in the pressurized hell. He was driven by 2 fears: that the work would stop and that the tower would not rest on sound rock. He ignored the increasingly frequent and severe warnings issued by his own body. The symptoms of caissons disease, or the bends, began to escalate dramatically. The joint agony. The most common affliction was crippling pain in the joints. Sandhogs often collapsed moments after emerging from the airlocks, writhing in agony. The paralysis. Nitrogen bubbles lodging in the spinal cord caused paralysis of the arms and legs. The vertigo. Bubbles affecting the inner ear led to severe dizziness and nausea, forcing men to crawl. Workers who suffered these attacks were often left permanently crippled or died swiftly. Doctors believed it was merely rheumatism brought on by cold, damp conditions or exhaustion. Washington, reading scientific papers from around the world, began to piece together the truth. It was the decompression itself. The rate of pressure release was too fast, allowing the nitrogen to bubble and inflict systemic damage. He implemented new, slower decompression procedures, forcing men to spend hours in the airlocks, adjusting the pressure minute by minute, a radical, life-saving measure at the time. Yet the work was urgent. The men were paid hourly, and often workers would bribe the airlock attendants to rush their decompression time, often with fatal results. Chapter 5. The Crippling Blow and the Silence of the Master. In 1872, the Manhattan caisson had reached its deepest point, burrowing into the bedrock under the pressure of the rising granite tower. It was the hardest part of the entire project, and Washington Roebling was there. That year, a massive fire erupted deep within the Manhattan caisson due to an overheating air pump. The flames, stoked by the high oxygen air, threatened to consume the foundation. Roebling, showing immense physical courage, directed the efforts to flood the chamber with water, saving the tower foundation, but risking his own life in the process. It was during this time that the disease finally claimed him. After a long, arduous shift in the high pressure, Washington emerged severely ill. The agonizing cramps and paralysis of the bends set in, followed by a general systemic breakdown. The symptoms never fully abated. He was left with an array of debilitating chronic conditions. Chronic pain and near paralysis that confined him to his home. Severe noise sensitivity, hyperacusis, that made the cacophony of the construction site unbearable. Near blindness that prevented him from reading complex blueprints. Washington Roebling was now virtually an invalid, unable to visit the bridge site, unable to speak clearly, and certainly unable to climb the soaring towers. The chief engineer of the greatest construction project in the world was physically removed from his work. The press, sensing disaster, called for his resignation. The bridge company board, filled with skeptical businessmen and outright political operators, demanded an immediate replacement. The Roebling dynasty, which had dreamed and designed the structure, was now broken. John was dead. Washington was paralyzed. The project seemed doomed. But as the granite walls rose slowly from the water, a quiet, observant figure stepped into the breach, armed with a telescope, a pen, and an iron will. Book 3. The Political War. Chapter 6. Boss Tweed and the Octopus of Tammany Hall. Before Emily Roebling could pick up the mantle of engineering, she and her husband had to contend with the financial and legal quagmire left by William Mageer Boss Tweed, the leader of the corrupt political machine, Tammany Hall. Tweed's influence was absolute. He was a state senator, a county supervisor, and the most powerful man in New York, ruling the city through a complex network of kickbacks, voter fraud, and strategic appointments. To Tweed, the Brooklyn Bridge was not an everlasting work of art, but the greatest opportunity for theft in American history. The bridge project provided Tweed with perfect cover. It was a massive, complex project that was nearly impossible for the public to audit, involving thousands of subcontracts and specialized materials. The scheme began early. Tweed secured the legislative charter for the bridge only after he and his partners were granted seats on the New York Bridge Company Board of Trustees. This gave them control over all financial disbursements. Tweed's most trusted crony, Richard Slippery Dick Connolly, served as the city comptroller, signing off on the exorbitant, fraudulent invoices. The method was simple. The ring contractors. Tweed established companies secretly owned by the ring. The markup. Contracts for basic materials like lumber, iron, and stone were marked up by hundreds or even thousands of %. For example, furniture for the modest new courthouse cost the city $180,000, equivalent to millions today. The bridge was even bigger.
Chapter 7. The Scams and the Battle for Budget Integrity. The sheer scale of the theft associated with the bridge was staggering, threatening to cripple the budget and halt construction long before the cables could be spun. The land grab. Tweed's associates purchased the entire waterfront area intended for the Manhattan anchorage and approach far below market value. They then sold this land back to the city for the bridge at absurdly inflated prices, pocketing millions in profit overnight. The cement swindle. The most infamous fraud involved the cement used to set the caissons and build the early layers of the tower. A firm controlled by Tweed was granted the exclusive cement contract. The company billed the bridge company $12 per barrel for cement that cost $3 per barrel on the open market. The $9 difference on every barrel went directly into the pockets of the Tweed ring. Washington Roebling, from the onset, was a formidable obstacle. His dedication to quality meant he could not be bought or persuaded to accept inferior materials, even at inflated prices. He battled constantly with the board, often receiving thinly veiled threats. He was forced to focus almost as much energy on auditing invoices and verifying material quality
as he did on engineering. The crisis came to a head in 1871. Investigative journalists, led by the New York Times and Thomas Nast's devastating political cartoons in Harper's Weekly, exposed the full scope of the Tweed Ring's operations. The resulting public outrage was so immense that the ring collapsed. Tweed was indicted, and many of his associates fled the country. The bridge was now financially solvent again, but the damage was done. Millions had been wasted, and public confidence was shattered. The new board was cautious, skeptical, and desperately needed assurance that the project could be finished both honestly and structurally soundly. With Washington Roebling paralyzed, confined to his bedroom at 110 Columbia Heights, Brooklyn, the task of restoring public and financial confidence while simultaneously managing the most complex engineering task on Earth fell entirely to Emily Warren Roebling. She was about to embark on one of the most remarkable and unacknowledged careers in American history.
Book 4, The Woman Who Bridged the Gap. Chapter 8, From Society Wife to Structural Engineer. Emily Warren was born into a prominent, well-connected family in Cold Spring, New York. She received a far better education than most women of her era, but it was in the realm of society, history, and language, not mathematics or mechanics. She met Washington Roebling during the Civil War, where he was an engineering officer and she was visiting her brother, a commanding general. When Washington was struck down by Caisson's disease in 1872, Emily made a decision that irrevocably changed her life and the fate of the Brooklyn Bridge. She would not let the dream die. Washington's suffering was profound. He was in constant pain, could only communicate in whispers, and was paralyzed by sound. Yet his mind was intact, a brilliant, calculating engine trapped within a broken body. Emily became the crucial link between that mind and the monumental construction site visible from their window. Her education in engineering began as a matter of necessity, but it quickly became an obsession. Washington would communicate his instructions and calculations often by scribbling on pads, using finger movements, or whispering into her ear. Emily was forced to learn the language of his discipline. Higher mathematics. She mastered the complex differential equations required for calculating loads, stresses, and the curve of the suspension cables, the catenary. Material science. She studied metallurgy to understand the quality control necessary for the revolutionary Bessemer steel wire that Roebling had specified for the cables. Construction management. She learned the logistics of coordinating hundreds of laborers, stone cutters in Maine, and wire mills in Pennsylvania. The male assistant engineers, foremen, and contractors initially treated her with patronizing contempt. They would often question her instructions, expecting her to run back to her sick husband for confirmation. But Emily could always prove her directives. She knew the plans, the figures, and the structural necessity better than anyone. She commanded respect not by title, but by demonstrable, intimidating competence. She began to spend entire days at the construction office near the tower site. She handled the contract negotiations, managed the payrolls, and defended the integrity of the design against constant scrutiny. She was, in every practical sense, the chief engineer.
Chapter 9. The Impossible Task of the Cable Spinning. By 1878, the two massive granite towers stood complete, majestic and solid, rising 276 feet from the river. The final, most delicate and most terrifying phase was about to begin, the spinning of the four main cables. This was John Roebling's patented ingenious method, where strength was achieved through the sheer volume of finely drawn wire. Each of the 4 main cables had to be made up of 5,282 individual steel wires bundled into 19 individual strands. A single faulty wire could jeopardize the entire structure. The process required a massive continuous loop of steel wire driven by steam engines to carry individual wires across the river one by one over the length of the span. As the wires accumulated, they were bundled, compressed, and wrapped tightly into the massive load-bearing cables. This critical phase was almost ruined by greed and fraud, a late echo of the Tweed era. The contract for the steel wire was awarded to the J. Lloyd Hay Company. Shortly after the spinning began, Washington Roebling, watching through his telescope from his window, noticed that the deflection of the guide wire seemed slightly off. He relayed the suspicion to Emily. Emily took immediate action. She ordered samples of the newly spun wire to be removed and tested. The results were chilling. Hay was supplying inferior galvanized steel wire that was weak, brittle, and structurally unsound. It was an astonishing act of sabotage, likely intended to save the contractor money by using cheaper scrap steel, but it endangered thousands of lives and the legacy of the Roeblings. The fraud was exposed, Hay's contracts were canceled, and a furious legal battle erupted. Emily, armed with tensile strength data and metallurgical reports, testified and fought the contractor, forcing the replacement of thousands of feet of faulty wire that had already been spun. This crisis was a turning point. Emily Roebling was no longer just the assistant. She was the project's defender, its quality controller, and its ultimate legal authority. The board, the press, and the engineers no longer questioned her. She had won the battle against corruption and physics, earning her place in history as the silent partner who saved the bridge. The correct, superior steel wire was eventually sourced, and under Emily's constant supervision, the intricate, beautiful process of cable spinning continued. The bridge was finally, irrevocably coming together.